I'm very excited about this next panel on oceans and fisheries. I would like to invite track one of our panel to the stage, which includes Ambassador Dave Bolton, Commissioner Doug Vincent Lang, Manuel Carmona Yebra, Admiral Moore, Shayna Wisdom, and Zachary Penny. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you for being here, everyone. So I'm going to kick it right off here. Can each of you tell us your number one policy barrier that is currently at odds with a healthy blue economy?
That's a great question to start with. So the Arctic is warming. The Arctic Ocean is warming along with it, also becoming more acidic, in some places fresher as well. The ecosystem of the Arctic Ocean, including the Bering Sea, is changing radically, I think, in ways we don't fully understand. This is creating certain opportunities for business, but also creating some real problems, and particularly for those who are trying to manage the fisheries in the area. I spent a good part of yesterday, Rachel, hearing from people who lived along the Yukon-Kuskokwim River, very upset about the very low returns of Yukon River, Kuskokwim River, Chinook, and salmon. So that problem, the problem of dealing with the changing ocean ecosystem and making the fisheries management mechanisms that are distributed in a lot of ways, is a real policy problem. I'd say that is a big barrier. There are other barriers. That's the one first in my mind, possibly because I heard a lot about it yesterday.
Great. Thanks, Ambassador. Commissioner?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. This is great. I think it's the multi-jurisdictional nature of the deep blue ocean. The multi-jurisdictional nature of the deep blue ocean. You know, when you're dealing with freshwater, you're dealing with fewer jurisdictions, but when you get out anywhere from 300 to 200 miles and then beyond that, you're dealing with all these different jurisdictions, from potentially beyond 300 miles with China, Korea, Asian countries, Russia, and China. And when you're dealing in 200 to 300 miles, you're dealing with National Marine Fisheries Service, Alaska, and then the expectations of users that are involved in all those ones. So really, I think the number one policy thing is to try to figure out a common theme to address those multi-jurisdictional issues moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for having me, for inviting me to this conference. I would say that the one main policy barrier is the sheer complexity of the crisis that we're facing. We have climate change, everybody knows about that, but we also have a biodiversity crisis, also driven by things like overexploitation of resources. Overfishing is one of those for the oceans. And then we have a third crisis, is the pollution, is the fact that we use basic stuff for life, like air and water, like a garbage can, like Jacques Cousteau used to say, the famous oceanographer. I like that because this is it. We are facing multiple crises. There are some trade-offs that are present when we're tackling one of those for the others, and the complexity of facing that and the scientific knowledge that we need is one policy barrier indeed to progress. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Yebra. Shayna?
We feel that it's the timeline of federal funding has been one of the biggest barriers. Coming from private industry into federal, that's been one of the challenges in my new job. And it's really the uncertainty. So AUS operates under a 5-year agreement, but are subject to annual appropriations, as many of we are in the room. And not knowing what's coming down and how much is coming down really affects our ability to be in front of all of the changes that are happening. The second part of that is that everything in Alaska takes time. Building relationships, maintaining relationships, working with communities, all of the different pieces with field work, and it takes time. And when you're under an annual appropriation of use it or lose it, it's really a challenge. And the third part of that is how communities can use that federal funding. It's very onerous for communities to try to propose and get the work and then administer it and then deal with all the reporting and then do the field work and then use it or lose it. So I think the timing cycle is a huge, huge deal, especially with all the federal funding coming our way to Alaska.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a different route, and my apologies if this is a little esoteric, but so I'm Zach Penny, and I traveled here yesterday from DC, and I'm the senior advisor to NOAA on both tribal engagement and fisheries. And so the lens that I view the world primarily comes from my background as a Nez Perce tribal member from Idaho. And so when I was thinking about this question as folks were talking, I kind of dialed it back a little bit more just to sort of how I see certain things in DC work. And this isn't necessarily a NOAA perspective, but I would just throw it out there for folks to think about is when I think about ecosystems, every time I think about a fishery, I kind of like, well, what exactly are they defining as a fishery? Is it commercial fishing? Is it recreational fishing? Is it subsistence fishing? Fisheries is really about people in a lot of ways. Fish tend to do pretty good by themselves. Fish don't necessarily need human management. We need to manage ourselves. But what I was thinking about was this balance that many societies in the world now have with wanting certainty for power. I was listening to that last session. Certainty for water, food, all of these things. But sometimes certainty that we depend on as a society doesn't necessarily mean that makes the ecosystem resilient. And I'm saying that from places in the Pacific Northwest where dams provide electricity, but it had a major ecosystem impact. And so one of the things, especially for, I'd say, a lot of tribal societies, indigenous nations, where we don't make up the majority anymore, that those folks that are looking for those votes are trying to make sure that they keep that certainty. But when it comes to things like Pacific salmon stocks, any of the fish stocks, marine mammals, and things like that, that sometimes we need to figure out what that balance is between making sure we have certainty for the ways that people's ways of life versus the resilience, because resilience to me is something that's really long-term. And in some cases, if I just think about the history of fisheries in other places of the world, as well as places in the U.S., along the East Coast, Pacific Northwest, that in some cases our track record for keeping that resilience isn't the best. So that's that balance between keeping certainty and resilience. Those are the things I was thinking about.
Thank you, Admiral.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So as the Coast Guard's commander here in Alaska in what we call District 17, as I think about policy and things that are maybe gaps there, I think the way I'd like to answer that, the way I think of it is the majority of vessels that we see today that transit through Western Alaska, that transit through the Bering Strait, are not U.S. flagged vessels. So I think about policy gaps in terms of many, I would say most of the vessels that we see that create some of that risk and are part of the blue economy, U.S. policy doesn't apply to them. And that's how I would answer what I think our greatest challenge is. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Admiral Moore. And I'm actually going to stick with you. So we know that the Coast Guard plays a massive role in Alaska and in the United States with managing illegal and unregulated fisheries. I believe it was you, Admiral, who shared on this stage last year, which was just weeks after the war broke out in Ukraine. It was shared by the Coast Guard that the one permissible line of communication for the United States, at that time at least, was between the Coast Guard and Russia, because they knew that communication breakdown of all communication lines could not break down, right? And that was too vital. So I'm paraphrasing. Correct any of that if that's wrong. I'm not an admiral. Everyone here knows that. Can you speak to how that's going and what your observations are more broadly in the northern Pacific in regards to illegal and unregulated fisheries in the context of the Arctic?
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. So we did talk about this last year on the stage here, and so nothing has changed from the sense that we do have the ability today to talk to our counterparts in the Russian border guard for any emergent issue. And so, from a Coast Guard standpoint, whether you're talking about managing fisheries on the maritime boundary line, which is a very rules-based system that has been in effect for decades, it has become a very well-managed system, I guess I should say. It hasn't always been that way, but we have a good track record of cooperating and working in that area. We can still talk to the Russians, and we do that on occasion when we need to manage whether it's boundary issues or mass rescue potentially, pollution response. I mean, it's very similar to any of us in your neighborhood. You have to be able to speak to your neighbor, your next door neighbor, You don't have to be best friends with them, but you got to be able to speak to them for shared interest across what is an actual physical border directly with Russia here in Alaska. So that hasn't changed. In terms of IUU fishing, the Coast Guard worldwide is focused on IUU fishing. Most of us here probably realize that the international fishing community, whether they're Chinese fishing fleets, Taiwanese fishing fleets, there are many different countries that are involved in sending fishing fleets great distances internationally to fish, and they are approaching Alaskan waters. I mean, today, with warming water that is pushing the fishing stocks north, we're seeing international fishing fleets approach the southern boundaries of the Aleutians in ways that we've never seen before.
Interesting, and no doubt that's of concern for communities there as well. Let's turn now to Mr. Yebra. Thank you so much for traveling here, long distance for sure. And for anyone who hasn't reviewed the agenda lately, Mr. Yebra traveled here on behalf of the EU. So he is Counselor for Environment and Oceans as part of a delegation for the European Union. So I had to Google this to be sure because I'm not from Europe, but there are 27 countries in the European Union. How do you balance the competing interests and then lock in shared priorities when you are working with coastal states, inland states, language barriers, perhaps historical use, which is fascinating. I was thinking that you're from Spain. Of course, Spain has, many, many, many generations of historical use stories in terms of their seafood and fisheries, and then as well all of the mixed and different fish stocks between these countries. How does the EU navigate that? Big question, I know.
This is big indeed. Where to start? I think I'll start with the treaties of the European Union. I'm a lawyer by background, so that always helps to fix in the agreement at the time. The fisheries policy of the EU, which we call common fisheries policy, is really one of those few ones where the EU has it as an exclusive competence. So only the EU as a whole, so meaning the consensus between the 27 EU member states and partially also the European Parliament, decide where to fish, when, what are the quotas, what are the technical measures involved, the control, the monitoring, etc., etc. So this is one of those policies where the EU certainly has a lot of weight as a common policy, agreed always at EU level. The difficulties of that, many. You can imagine. And I've been there because at the time, some time ago, I was working actually in coordinating the legal work to get all these quotas distributed among member states. So you can imagine. It was working to the night. It was, multilateral negotiations in miniature between 27 member states, not of all fisheries powers. So of course, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Portugal, the UK at the time. These were big fishing nations. And that requires a lot of coordination. But as common fisheries policy, we base our work on certain principles. Sustainable fisheries, technical measures that are applicable across the EU, very solid monitoring control system. And in that way, whereas every year to distribute these quotas, you have some changes in the way they are distributed, and we get the scientific advice, normally from ICES, and then put forward a proposal to member states. Whereas these varies every year, there are certain essential principles that do not vary. And the basic line is this is a shared resource. We're not going to shoot ourselves in the foot by, allowing, Spain to fish it all. We need to have some kind of, distribution, and that has worked pretty well.
Yeah, interesting. I'm going to turn now quickly to Commissioner Vincent Lang. Everyone here knows that bycatch has held the headlines in the media for years. And we also know that Governor Dunleavy has prioritized and created an entire task force dedicated to bycatch reduction. We also know that the seafood industry in Alaska has significantly reduced its bycatch numbers over the past 20 years, and so the industry is very engaged in that. What does success look like in terms of bycatch reduction, and what should our expectations be about bycatch reduction in the future?
That's a very good question. So, bycatch, when we're not meeting needs for salmon escapement in river systems across Alaska, every fish matters to people in those situations. So, recognizing that, the governor created a task force to evaluate bycatch and make recommendations as to what we can do moving forward to try to reduce bycatch, and what kind of both research is needed to address those questions, as well as what kind of management actions are needed to reduce bycatch. That task force completed its report work after about a year. To make sure that that report's just not sitting on people's desks and sitting on people's bookcases, I actually created a sub-portion of that task force to advise the Department of Fish and Game on how to implement those recommendations moving forward, both in terms of research and in terms of management actions that we could take. And those things are actually occurring right now. The North Pacific Fishery Management Council is going to be looking at chum salmon bycatch recommendations moving forward. And then they're also looking at what we're going to do in the Gulf of Alaska, which potentially includes rationalization of the trawl fisheries in the Gulf of Alaska to reduce bycatch. What does success look like? I think success looks like understanding how bycatch is contributing to salmon returns in different fisheries across the state of Alaska. And then success looks at trying to reduce bycatch to the extent practicable. Do I think bycatch is going to be completely eliminated? No, because those fisheries are important to the state's economy and to feeding the world's population. But I think we should take meaningful steps to try to minimize them.
Thank you, Commissioner. Shana, as someone focused on sort of community partnerships, outreach, and then adding those in with a lot of science and in the research community, do you have sort of a second comment as a follow-up to that on what success can look like? A lot of communities that you're working in and your team is working in, I know, are affected by, run failures, returns, and the entire conversation on bycatch as well.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we're really trying to get out there and understand what type of assets and information we can get. Ocean information is a very broad term, and that's what AUS's mission is to try to pull in ocean information for ocean users. And so it's assets, it's getting out there and listening, it's finding ways to marry scientific data with indigenous knowledge so that they're not so mutually exclusive, so that we're using all of the knowledge systems that we can to try to understand what's going on and then try to understand what to do about it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. For those in the room who don't know, so Ambassador Dave Bolton is here on behalf of the White House, and specifically within the White House, the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. But back in the day when I first met Dave, he was the ambassador for oceans at the State Department. He was in that role for a long time. So kind of with still your hat on, with the White House hat on, but also putting on your old State Department hat, can you just share with the room, for those who don't know, and I always learn something new when I hear you describe this, a quick paraphrased version of the very big story of fisheries moratoriums in the Arctic, and what is the legal status of fisheries in the Arctic? I know you were a part of that there, and also through your work with the Arctic Council.
So the story actually begins here in Alaska. Sometime around 2010 or so, the United States, with the support of the state and the industry and communities in northern Alaska, created a moratorium, effectively, on commercial fishing north of the Bering Strait in the US EEZ. It's still in effect today. We did so because at the time, we didn't have enough scientific information with which to manage commercial fisheries in that part of our EEZ properly. But our jurisdiction, like any other countries, ends at the 200-mile line. And if we were going to prevent, or at least delay, the advent of commercial fisheries in the high seas area of the Central Arctic Ocean, the area beyond 200 miles from any of the coastal states, we needed to do so through some international agreement. And it was a long way there. It took from the time Alaska and the Secretary of Commerce at the time adopted the Arctic Fisheries Management Plan here at home, about 8 years. But we produced an agreement. It is binding. It's among 10 parties, including the European Union, also China, Japan, South Korea, and a number of Arctic states. It entered into force in June of 2021. The first meeting of the parties was delayed because of COVID, but it did actually take place last November in Seoul. Another meeting in Utqiagvik took place just a couple of weeks ago to start working or work some more on the science program that's supposed to be built. So the system we created is up and running. There are still big challenges, but there will not be commercial fisheries in this area for at least the life of the agreement, which is 16 years. And that can be extended, indeed it will be extended in 5-year increments unless any of the parties object. My own sense is that there will be a moratorium on commercial fisheries for quite some time in that high seas area of the Central Arctic Ocean. It's quite a success story, and we're hoping it sticks.
Okay, in the event that it wasn't renewed in 16 years, I'd be curious to just get your thoughts on that. I know that's a pie in the sky question, but specifically in terms of preparation to the commissioner and the admiral, what would be required?
Well, we're not going to be as optimistic that some of our eastern neighbors won't necessarily not want to extend that moratorium in place. So we're preparing to have fisheries in the Arctic because as the Arctic Ocean opens, we see opportunities for our coastal communities to develop fisheries, and we certainly don't want to be left on shore while Russia and other countries come up and fish those waters. So we actually put a budget request in this year to start getting some money that we could use to match federal money to start collecting that fishery research, which David said is badly needed and sorely needed to identify the stock compositions and the biomasses up there. But we also need to get started on what a fishery management plan looks like, whether we'd have a CDQ program like we have in the Bering Sea, and what kind of distribution allocation shares we would have there. So we're starting to think through those processes. We're starting to do that work so that we're prepared in the event that the fisheries open.
Admiral, care to comment?
Yeah, thanks. I think the way I would answer that in line with what the commissioner just said is, we would look to extend the current successful programs we have today that work, as I described earlier, in the Bering. We'd look to just flip those up into the high north, right? So that same management of a maritime boundary line, the same oversight of quotas and enforcement regime. I mean, there is, if you have the assets available to do that, the polar security cutters, our new icebreakers are coming. If you have the assets to get up there and do that, there should be no reason why you couldn't set up that same very successful fisheries enforcement regime up into the high Arctic if you ever had to.
Great, thank you. Now to Dr. Penny. You focus on oceans at the U.S. U.S. Department of Commerce. That's an interesting intersection between a lot of things: environment, resources, economics. So what are the priorities of this administration when it comes to advancing this sector economically and sustainably?
That's a good question, and I think I can speak mainly to the fishery side of this because for me, even just thinking about NOAA's a really big house, and everything from the satellites to the ocean observing systems. It's way more than just fisheries. Thinking about the Weather Service. Everything that we do is kind of dictated by weather to some degree. I think some people probably didn't show up because of weather related, but I think the administration. Priorities through NOAA. My boss, Dr. Spinrad, we want to make a climate-ready nation, and things are changing, and to do that, I think the investments to help this, not just Alaska, but I think the entire country to adapt to what those changes are in a smart way. That also, again, getting back to that resilience that we need long term is really what this administration is trying to do.
Great, thank you. Now I think we're going to move to audience Q&A. Is that true? Yep. Okay, here we go. Do you believe lab-grown seafood can help make fisheries more sustainable?
In thinking about lab-grown, I guess I would make a distinction if they mean actually lab-grown in a lab or if it's aquaculture. And I think anything that's human produced through aquaculture, I mean, there's various pros and cons of that, but definitely some of the things that I think are happening in Alaska, particularly with shellfish aquaculture, kelp aquaculture, and things like that, that through going neat, I mean, there's a lot of seafood that is still imported to the United States, and anything that we can do sustainably using coastal resources is a good thing. Now, I wouldn't venture to say that getting more further into like a lab and genetic things like that, or genetic testing, or genetically modified foods, that's something I would stay away from personally. But if it's aquaculture done right, then I think that's a good thing.
Yes, the genetically modified salmon debate has been hot in Alaska to the negative. No Alaskans want that here. Yes, Mr. Yebra.
Yes, just one thing. I'm not sure this answers the question, but indeed some seafood can be very sustainable. Mollusks, for example, or oyster beds, they're not only sustainable because they filter water, so the water is clearer and cleaner, but also provide for adaptation to climate change of the coastline. And this is being used in some projects I know, for example, in the United States. So I don't know if that's to answer the question, but certainly it can be extremely sustainable seafood.
Thank you. Would the signing of the Conference of the Law Sea, I think they might mean the convention, help combat some of the ocean jurisdictional barriers as mentioned by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Commissioner?
So the United States is not a party to this international treaty called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but we follow it in basically all meaningful respects, at least with respect to fisheries management. And the truth is, even if we became party to it, and that would require Senate action, it wouldn't actually change the jurisdictional issues that Doug was describing earlier. We would have to do somehow internally if there's going to be some adjustment in the way fisheries are managed between the federal government, the state, and also tribal fisheries management in some parts of the country. So no, it wouldn't really matter. There are many other things, many other reasons why we ought to join the Law of the Sea Convention, but it wouldn't fix this particular situation.
Okay, thank you. How do you define indigenous knowledge? What composes indigenous knowledge, and how is it implemented?
Well, I'll tackle that. I think indigenous knowledge is a knowledge of people who live in the landscape, have cultural ties to that landscape, and can inform management decisions made by people that are managing the resources they're tied to. So I think it's critical to have that information incorporated into the decision-making processes moving forward. And I think there are processes, at least through the Alaska Board of Fisheries and Board of Game, where that information is brought forward through advisory committees and through public testimony to ensure that that's enshrined into our decision-making processes.
Thank you.
Can I just add some more onto that? Indigenous knowledge right now is a really important thing that the administration is also taking seriously. There was recently Indigenous knowledge guidance that the White House developed that's currently being, throughout the different departments within the United States government. How are we actually going to incorporate, I shouldn't say incorporate, include Indigenous knowledge into our decision making? Because I'd say that sometimes the best available science isn't our most recent data point. Sometimes it's a lack of representation of voices that haven't been in that room before. And when I think also of Indigenous knowledge, I don't think of it necessarily as a new concept. It might be new to a lot of folks who've primarily come from a Western science point of view, but in places like Alaska, it's an unparalleled knowledge of something that always has been, is the way I would sort of define it.
Okay. And when it comes to climate change and our oceans, we know that there are some clear winners and losers. Can you describe steps that we can take to adapt to the negatives while taking advantage of the positives? And please be concise. We're running into our next track conversation. Thank you.
I can say that I think we are all losers, really, in the long run. There might be some winners and losers in the short term or the medium term. But by the end of the century, on current trends, with the, 1 meter sea level rise, global warming around 3 degrees Celsius, we're certainly all losers, because this is catastrophic change to the basis of our life, really, ecosystems. 50% of global GDP depends on a healthy nature. nature is ruined by climate change, then we are in deep trouble. And I think the oceans is really the canary in the coal mine in this, because it's been bailing us out for a long time. It's been really absorbing around a third of all the CO2 that we put in the atmosphere, and around 90% of the heat is going to the oceans. The NASA, I think, or it was NOAA. I'm not sure it was NOAA or NASA. I read that they have now measured the global average temperature of the seas, and it's the highest ever recorded. So it's growing steadily, and this bodes not very well for marine ecosystems. We were discussing about the Central Arctic Ocean Agreement, and we're assuming that there will be fish there to fish if ever this commercial fish is going on. But when we heat the planet that way, the actual currents that bring food around the fisheries around the world will change, will slow down. We're perceiving that already. So the whole system is in a turbulent, moving target mode. Just to go back to the question, really, I think we're all losers in the long term. Luckily, I think we're getting some action. Is not enough, but in the EU, certainly we're taking this very seriously. We're implementing targets for climate, for emissions in law, so it will be, you can be taken to court at some point if the targets are not reached at the Court of Justice of the European Union. These will be binding measures to do our bit. We're responsible for around 9% of emissions globally. Thanks.
Yeah, we hear a lot about fish stocks moving north, but fascinating to think about that data with the currents as well. Any other comments from the panel? No? Okay. Oh,
I'll take a
Commissioner.
shot at that one. So in the Bering Sea, we have, with climate change, we have winners and losers. We have right now sablefish, pollock, and sockeye salmon clearly winning. But then on the other hand, we have crab and chum salmon losing. Understanding the dynamics and unraveling how those factors are interrelated to causing those changes is complex. The ocean's big. It's going to take a multi-jurisdictional effort to get there. But understandably, the people that are affected by the declining stocks don't have the patience to wait for that data to come in. So it's not for lack of trying. I've crossed everybody in this table that's trying to get those answers, but I just have to tell people it's going to take a little bit of time to unravel them and understand how we can address them moving forward with management.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you to the rest of the panelists. Let's give them a warm round of applause.